Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Luther Lindsay had built everything from nothing. At 38, he owned Lindsay Tech Solutions, a cybersecurity firm that protected Fortune 500 companies from digital threats. His military background and Army intelligence had given him the skills, and his natural brilliance had done the rest. The company's success had afforded him the sprawling suburban home where he now sat in his study, reviewing quarterly reports. "Luther, dinner's ready." Rosario's voice echoed through the house. His wife of 7 years appeared in the doorway, her dark hair perfectly styled as always. At 34, she still turned heads wherever they went, though lately Luther noticed she'd been turning more heads than usual and enjoying it. "Just finishing up," Luther replied, closing his laptop. He'd met Rosario at a charity gala, where her work as an event coordinator had impressed him. She'd seemed ambitious, driven, a perfect match for his own aspirations. Now, watching her fidget with her phone at the dinner table, he wondered when the conversation had become so stilted. "Glenn Mayer called earlier," Rosario mentioned, picking at her salad. "The fire department wants to do that safety inspection next week." Luther nodded. "Good. With all the renovations we've done, it's smart to have everything checked out." He'd added a home office, upgraded the electrical system, and installed a state-of-the-art security network. The house was his fortress, his sanctuary from the corporate battles he fought daily. After dinner, Luther retreated to his study while Rosario disappeared upstairs, claiming she had calls to make for an upcoming corporate event. It had become their routine, polite distance masquerading as domestic bliss. He buried himself in work, analyzing the latest threat assessments for his clients, unaware that his own home harbored the greatest threat of all. Philip Moran adjusted his tie as he waited in the hotel bar downtown. At 42, he possessed the kind of practiced charm that opened doors and loosened tongues. His tailored suit and confident smile suggested success, though the truth was far more complex. Philip lived in the shadows between industries, gathering information that certain parties found valuable. When Rosario Lindsay walked in, Philip's smile was genuine. She was more than just another mark now. 6 months of careful cultivation had made her his willing accomplice. He'd met her at a wine tasting, introduced himself as a consultant for luxury brands. The story was believable enough, and Rosario had been hungry for attention her husband no longer provided. "You look beautiful," Philip said, standing to greet her. "How's Luther?" "Same as always, buried in his work." Rosario slid into the booth across from him. "Sometimes I wonder if he'd notice if I disappeared entirely." Philip had counted on that neglect. Luther Lindsay's cybersecurity firm held contracts with major defense contractors and tech giants. The kind of proprietary information that flowed through Lindsay Tech Solutions was worth millions to the right buyers. But getting access required patience and the perfect inside position. "I've been thinking about what we discussed," Philip said, leaning forward. "About your future. About us." Rosario's eyes lit up. "Really? There's an opportunity coming up. A big one. But I'll need your help." Philip reached across the table, taking her hand. "Luther's working on something new, isn't he? Something big." "The government contract," Rosario whispered. "He's been obsessed with it for months. Won't tell me anything specific, but I know it's huge." Philip squeezed her hand. "I think it's time we made our move. But first, I need to know more about his setup at home. His security systems, his routines, everything." Over the past month, Philip had been slowly mapping Luther's home through Rosario's casual observations. But he needed more than her scattered intelligence. He needed eyes and ears inside the Lindsay fortress itself. "There's going to be a fire inspection next week," Rosario mentioned. "Maybe that's your chance." Philip's mind raced. A fire inspection would give him legitimate access to the house's infrastructure. With the right preparation, he could install surveillance equipment that would give him everything he needed to crack Luther's business empire wide open. "Perfect," Philip smiled. "Tell me everything about this inspector." Glenn Mayer had been a firefighter for 15 years, and he prided himself on thorough inspections. The Lindsay house was impressive. Recent renovations, top-quality materials, and clearly no expense spared. Luther Lindsay seemed like a decent guy, answering questions professionally while his wife, Rosario, hovered nearby with nervous energy. "I'll need to check the electrical panels and wiring," Glenn explained, adjusting his gear. "With all the tech equipment you have, want to make sure everything's up to code." Luther nodded. "Of course. I'll be in my study if you need anything." Glenn worked methodically through the house. The main electrical panel was pristine, recently upgraded with surge protection systems that impressed even him. But when he moved to the secondary panel in the basement, something felt off. The access panel had been disturbed recently. Fresh scratches around the screws, slight misalignment. Opening the panel, Glenn's trained eyes immediately spotted the anomaly. Tucked behind the main electrical lines were small devices he'd never seen in a residential setup. Tiny cameras, audio receivers, and what looked like signal boosters. His blood ran cold as he realized what he was looking at. Someone had turned the Lindsay house into a surveillance network. Glenn quickly photographed the devices with his phone, his mind racing. This wasn't his area of expertise, but 15 years of fire safety had taught him to recognize when something was dangerous. And this felt very dangerous. He found Luther in his study, calmly reviewing documents. Rosario was nowhere to be seen. She'd mentioned running an errand about 20 minutes earlier. "Sir, I need you to be calm," Glenn said quietly, closing the study door. "When I leave, you need to leave. Do not stay here tonight." Luther looked up, alert. "Is there any problem?" Glenn shook his head grimly. "No, it's worse. While checking the wiring, I found something." He pulled out one of the smaller devices he'd carefully removed. This was hidden in the walls. Luther took the device, and Glenn watched the color drain from his face. As someone who specialized in cybersecurity, Luther immediately recognized what he was holding: a high-end surveillance transmitter, military grade, the kind used for industrial espionage. "How many?" Luther's voice was deadly calm. "At least 6 that I could see without pulling apart your walls. Maybe more." Glenn leaned closer. "Mr. Lindsay, I don't know what you're involved in, but whoever placed these, they've been watching everything, listening to everything." Luther stood slowly, his military training taking over. Someone had violated his sanctuary, turned his own home into a weapon against him. But more troubling was the timing. How had someone gained the access needed for this level of surveillance? "Thank you," Luther said, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "I need you to keep this between us for now." Glenn nodded. "You've got my number. Be careful, Mr. Lindsay." As the firefighter left, Luther examined the device more closely. Professional grade, expensive, recently installed. His mind cataloged the possibilities, but one truth became increasingly clear. This was an inside job. Someone with intimate knowledge of his home, his routines, his vulnerabilities had made this possible. Luther Lindsay was a man who had built his fortune by staying 3 steps ahead of his enemies. Now, someone had made the fatal mistake of bringing the war to his doorstep. As he gathered his emergency bag and prepared to leave his compromised home, Luther's analytical mind was already working on the most important puzzle of his life. Who had betrayed him? And how was he going to make them pay? Luther checked into the downtown Marriott under an alias, paying cash for a suite with multiple exit routes. Old habits from his Army intelligence days died hard, and right now, paranoia was keeping him alive. The surveillance device sat on the hotel room's desk like a poisonous spider, its implications growing more sinister by the hour. Using his secure laptop, Luther connected to his company's quantum encrypted network and began tracing the device's specifications. The model number led him down a rabbit hole of military contractors and black market suppliers. This wasn't amateur hour. Someone with serious resources and connections had targeted him specifically. His phone buzzed. "Rosario." "Luther? Where are you?" "Your car's gone, and there's no note." "Had to handle emergency at the office," Luther lied smoothly. "Client security breach. I'll be working late." "Oh." Her relief was audible. "Okay. Well, I'm having dinner with Krista tonight anyway." Girls' night. Krista McAllister was Rosario's business partner, someone Luther had met dozens of times. But something in his wife's voice, a forced casualness, triggered his instincts. He'd spent years reading people, and Rosario was definitely hiding something. After ending the call, Luther accessed his home security system remotely. The cameras throughout the house showed Rosario moving normally, preparing for her evening out. But Luther now viewed everything through a different lens. Was she acting differently? Avoiding certain areas? His paranoia felt justified when she carefully skirted the basement entrance, something she'd never done before. At 7:30 p.m., Rosario left the house dressed for a nice dinner. Luther tracked her location through the family plan GPS, watching as she drove not toward Krista's neighborhood, but downtown toward the luxury hotel district. Luther's blood turned to ice as he realized the truth. His wife wasn't meeting Krista. She was meeting someone else, someone who might be connected to the surveillance network that had violated his home. He waited 2 hours before making his move. Using a secondary security system he'd never told Rosario about, Luther re-entered his house through the garage. The place felt alien now, every shadow potentially hiding more surveillance equipment. Working with the precision of his military training, Luther began a methodical sweep of his home. He found 12 more devices, cameras in the bedroom, microphones in his study, signal boosters throughout the walls. Someone had been watching his every move for weeks, possibly months. But the most damning discovery came in Rosario's closet. Hidden behind her jewelry box was a second phone, one Luther had never seen before. The text message history made his stomach turn. Recording quality is perfect. He suspects nothing. Installation complete. Full audio-video coverage achieved. When do we make our move? The contact was listed simply as P. Luther sat on his bed, staring at the evidence of his wife's betrayal. But his analytical mind was already moving beyond the emotional impact. This wasn't just adultery. This was industrial espionage on a massive scale. Someone named P had turned his wife into an unwitting accomplice in a plot to steal his company's secrets. The question was, who was P? And what exactly were they after? Luther's hands moved across his laptop keyboard with deadly purpose. If someone wanted to play games with a former Army intelligence officer who specialized in digital warfare, they were about to learn a very expensive lesson. The hunt had begun. Philip Moran's apartment was a study in careful deception. Expensive furniture suggested success, but Luther's investigation revealed the truth. The lease was paid by a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Philip wasn't just a successful consultant. He was a professional infiltrator. Luther had spent the day following digital breadcrumbs, using his company's resources to dissect every aspect of Philip's life. The man was a ghost, someone who specialized in getting close to high-value targets and extracting their secrets. Rosario wasn't his first mark. She was just the latest in a string of betrayed spouses used to crack corporate security. But this operation was different. The surveillance equipment, the months of preparation, the resources involved, this wasn't about stealing random corporate secrets. Someone had specifically targeted Luther Lindsay and his company for reasons that went deeper than money. Luther's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his head of security at Lindsay Tech Solutions. Found something. Meeting Point Bravo. 1 hour. Marcus Webb had been Luther's sergeant in Afghanistan before joining the private sector. If Marcus had found something urgent enough to use their old military protocols, Luther needed to listen. They met in a parking garage downtown, using counter-surveillance techniques that had kept them alive in hostile territory. Marcus handed Luther a thick file. Someone's been probing our networks for 6 months, Marcus said grimly. Professional-grade attacks, testing our defenses. But here's the interesting part. They weren't trying to break in. They were mapping our security protocols. Luther flipped through the technical analysis. They want to know how we protect our clients' data. Exactly. And 3 weeks ago, someone started specifically targeting information about the Pentagon contract. They know about Project Blackbird. Luther's blood ran cold. Project Blackbird was Lindsay Tech Solutions' most classified contract, a next-generation cybersecurity system for critical military infrastructure. The project was worth hundreds of millions and contained technology that could revolutionize digital warfare. How many people know about Blackbird? Luther asked. Inside the company? Maybe 8 people. Outside, Marcus shrugged. Pentagon brass, a few contractors. It's compartmentalized. Someone on the outside is very interested in what we're building, Luther said slowly. Interested enough to spend months infiltrating my personal life to get access. Marcus studied his old friend. Luther, if they're after Blackbird, this isn't just corporate espionage. This is national security. We're talking about technology that could change the balance of power. Luther nodded grimly. Philip Moran wasn't just a con man looking for a quick score. He was working for someone with the resources and motivation to steal military secrets. The surveillance network in Luther's house wasn't about watching his personal life. It was about gaining access to his work systems, his encrypted communications, his development notes for Blackbird. I need everything we have on the attacks, Luther said. Traffic analysis, attack vectors, timing correlations. If Philip's been watching my house, I want to know exactly when his team tried to probe our networks. Already working on it, Marcus replied. But Luther, when we find these people, we call the FBI. This is bigger than corporate security now. Luther smiled coldly. Oh, we'll call the FBI. Eventually. But first, I'm going to give Mr. Moran and his friend something to really worry about. As Marcus drove away, Luther stood in the empty parking garage, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Philip had seduced his wife, violated his home, and attempted to steal military secrets that could endanger national security. The man had made 3 fatal mistakes. He'd underestimated Luther's capabilities, he'd left digital fingerprints, and he'd assumed Luther would play by conventional rules. Philip Moran was about to discover that former Army intelligence officers didn't fight fair. They fought to win. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. when Luther's facial recognition software finally identified Philip Moran's real identity. The man's carefully constructed background dissolved under scrutiny, revealing someone far more dangerous than a simple con artist. Philip Moran was actually Philip Morgan, a former CIA operative who'd been quietly dismissed from the agency 5 years earlier for ethical violations. The sanitized file Luther accessed through his military contacts painted a picture of someone who'd crossed lines that even the intelligence community wouldn't tolerate. But the real revelation came from overseas intelligence reports. Philip Morgan had been working for Vasilyev Industries, a Russian defense contractor with deep ties to military intelligence. Suddenly, the sophisticated surveillance equipment and the focus on Project Blackbird made perfect sense. This wasn't corporate espionage. It was state-sponsored theft of American military technology. Luther's secure phone rang. Marcus, you need to see this, his head of security said without preamble. I've been analyzing the network probes, and I found something that changes everything. 20 minutes later, they met in Luther's company's secure facility. Marcus led him to a room lined with servers and displays showing network traffic patterns. Look at this, Marcus said, pointing to a timeline on the main screen. The first probe of our networks happened 8 months ago. But here's the interesting part. It was a gentle reconnaissance, just checking our basic security architecture. Someone was planning this for a long time, Luther observed. It gets better. 3 weeks after that first probe, someone started researching you personally. Background checks, financial records, social media analysis. They were building a complete profile. Marcus clicked to the next screen. And here's when they identified Rosario as their entry point. Dating website activity, social media patterns, event attendance records. They studied her for 2 months before Philip ever approached her. Luther felt his anger crystallize into something colder and more focused. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a calculated attack on everything he'd built. They'd studied his wife like a target, identified her vulnerabilities, and exploited her loneliness with surgical precision. There's more, Marcus continued. The surveillance equipment in your house? It was specifically positioned to capture your work-from-home activities. They know your passwords, your secure communications, your development notes for Blackbird. How much do they have? Everything up to 2 weeks ago. But here's where it gets interesting. They haven't tried to access our primary servers yet. They're still in reconnaissance mode. Luther studied the data patterns, his mind working through the implications. They're not just after the current version of Blackbird. They want the complete development cycle, including future iterations. Which means they're planning something bigger than a simple data theft, Marcus concluded. Luther's phone buzzed with a text from Rosario, staying at Krista's tonight. Don't wait up. The lies were getting bolder. Luther checked the GPS tracking. Rosario was at the same downtown hotel where she'd met Philip the night before. His wife was becoming more careless, more confident that her deception was working. Marcus, I want you to implement Protocol 7, Luther said quietly. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Protocol 7 was their most extreme security measure, a complete digital lockdown that would isolate their networks from all outside access. That'll shut down operations for days, Marcus warned. Good. If Philip's team is planning something bigger, they'll have to accelerate their timeline. When they do, they'll make mistakes. Luther turned to leave, then paused. And Marcus? Start documenting everything. When this is over, I want evidence that will put Philip Morgan and his Russian friend away for the rest of their lives. As Luther drove through the empty city streets, he felt the familiar calm that had always preceded his most dangerous missions. Philip Morgan had made a fundamental error in targeting Luther Lindsay. The man had assumed he was dealing with a typical corporate executive, someone who would collapse under pressure and surrender his secrets to protect his family. Philip was about to learn that Luther Lindsay wasn't typical at all. He was a weapon forged in the mountains of Afghanistan and sharpened by years of digital warfare. And now that weapon was aimed directly at him. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Luther's plan crystallized over the next 48 hours, a masterpiece of deception that would have impressed his old intelligence handlers. If Philip Morgan wanted access to Project Blackbird, Luther would give it to him, along with a surprise that would destroy the entire Russian operation. Working from his secure facility, Luther began crafting a digital honeypot. To anyone accessing his work systems, it would appear that he was developing a critical vulnerability in Blackbird's architecture, a backdoor that could give an attacker complete control over American military networks. The fake intelligence was so convincing that even Luther's own team would have believed it without the proper authentication codes. But the real genius lay in the trap's secondary function. Anyone who accessed the false information would trigger a digital tracer that would lead Luther directly to their location, their equipment, and their communication networks. Philip's entire operation would be exposed the moment they took the bait. You're playing a dangerous game, Marcus warned as they reviewed the plan. If this backfires, you could lose everything. I've already lost everything that matters, Luther replied coldly. My home, my marriage, my trust. The only thing left is my company, and I'm not letting these bastards take that too. The psychological component of Luther's plan was equally sophisticated. Through carefully placed evidence, he began feeding Rosario information that suggested he was cracking under pressure. Fake arguments with the Pentagon, staged phone calls about budget overruns, deliberate signs of stress and paranoia. To someone reporting his every move, Luther appeared to be on the verge of a breakdown. Exactly the kind of vulnerability that intelligence operatives were trained to exploit. The first test came when Rosario arrived home after another girl's night, with obvious nervousness. How's work going? She asked casually, but Luther caught the calculation in her eyes. Terrible, Luther said, allowing genuine exhaustion to show. The Pentagon's threatening to pull the Blackbird contract. There's a security review next week. Rosario's face showed carefully controlled concern, but Luther saw the flash of excitement she couldn't quite hide. This was exactly the kind of intelligence Philip would want immediately. I'm sorry, honey. Is there anything I can do? Just be patient with me. I might be working from home more, trying to salvage this thing. Luther rubbed his temples dramatically. If I lose this contract, it could destroy the company. That night, Luther pretended to sleep while monitoring Rosario through thermal imaging. She waited exactly 2 hours before retrieving her hidden phone and typing frantically. Through his network monitoring, Luther watched the encrypted message leave their house and ping off several international servers before reaching its destination. Phase 1 was complete. Philip now believed that Luther was vulnerable and that Blackbird was in jeopardy. The Russians would want to accelerate their timeline, pushing Philip to take bigger risks. Luther's phone buzzed with a message from an untraceable number. We should meet. There are things you need to know about your wife. Luther smiled coldly. Philip was making his move, probably planning to pose as a concerned friend who discovered Rosario's affair. The classic manipulation tactic: destroy the target's emotional stability, then offer yourself as an ally who can solve their problems. Luther typed back, tomorrow, Riverside Park, 2 p.m. Come alone. As he prepared for the confrontation, Luther felt the familiar calm of a soldier heading into battle. Philip Morgan had spent months studying Luther's weaknesses, exploiting his wife, violating his home, and attempting to steal military secrets that could endanger American lives. Now, it was Luther's turn to show Philip what a real professional could do when properly motivated. The trap was set. Tomorrow, the war would begin in earnest. Philip Morgan arrived at Riverside Park with the confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. Dressed in expensive casual wear, he looked like exactly what he claimed to be: a successful consultant who'd stumbled onto information about Luther's unfaithful wife. Luther watched him from a concealed position for 10 minutes, noting the subtle signs of Philip's training. The way he scanned for surveillance, the positioning that kept escape routes open, the small earpiece that meant he wasn't alone. Philip was a professional, but Luther had spent years hunting professionals in far more dangerous environments. Mr. Lindsay, Philip called out as Luther approached the designated bench. Thank you for meeting me. I know this must be difficult. You said you had information about my wife, Luther replied, his voice carefully neutral. Philip's performance was masterful. The reluctant messenger, the concerned citizen who discovered something terrible. I'm afraid Rosario and I have been involved for several months. I thought you deserved to know. Luther watched Philip's micro-expressions, cataloging every tell. The man was enjoying this, savoring the moment of apparent victory. I see, Luther said quietly. And why tell me now? Because she's been asking me to help her access your business files, Philip continued, leaning forward with practiced sincerity. Something about proving her financial stake in your company. I got uncomfortable when she mentioned military contracts. The story was perfect, just enough truth to be believable, with Philip cast as the reluctant hero trying to prevent something worse. Luther almost admired the craftsmanship. She wanted you to steal from my company, Luther asked. She made it sound like she was protecting her own interests, Philip said carefully. But when she mentioned classified government work, I realized this was bigger than a divorce settlement. Luther nodded slowly, then smiled. Philip Morgan, formerly of the CIA's Special Activities Division, dismissed for selling intelligence to foreign nationals. Currently employed by Vasiliev Industries as a talent acquisition specialist. Philip's mask slipped for just a moment. Surprise, calculation, then resignation. Well, that's unfortunate. You've been conducting surveillance on my home for 3 months, Luther continued conversationally. 12 devices, military grade, specifically positioned to capture my work-from-home activities related to Project Blackbird. Philip's hand moved slightly toward his jacket, but Luther's voice stopped him. I wouldn't. Marcus has a rifle trained on you from 200 meters. Former Marine sniper. He doesn't miss. Philip's eyes flicked toward the tree line, but he couldn't spot Marcus's position. What do you want? Information. Who's running this operation? How many people are involved? What's the timeline for extracting Blackbird? You're not FBI, Philip observed. This isn't an official investigation. No, Luther agreed. This is personal. You violated my home, manipulated my wife, and attempted to steal technology that protects American lives. So we're going to do this the hard way. Luther's phone buzzed. A text message with a single photo. Rosario entering a downtown building with a man Luther didn't recognize. Your backup team just picked up my wife, Luther said, showing Philip the image. Interesting tactical choice. You obviously don't know me very well. Philip's confidence was cracking. What are you talking about? Rosario has been feeding you false information for the past week. Everything she's told you about Blackbird has been carefully crafted disinformation. The vulnerability you think exists? It's actually a tracer program that's been mapping your entire network since the moment you accessed it. Luther stood up, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Right now, FBI agents are raiding your safe house, your communication hub, and arresting your Russian contacts. Your operation is blown, your team is compromised, and you're completely alone. Philip finally reached for his weapon, but Luther was faster. Years of military training kicked in as Luther disarmed Philip with brutal efficiency, leaving the spy unconscious on the park bench. Marcus emerged from the tree line, rifle still ready. How long until the FBI gets here? 5 minutes, Luther replied, zip-tying Philip's hands. Just enough time to search him for anything useful. As sirens approached in the distance, Luther felt a cold satisfaction. Philip Morgan had made the classic mistake of underestimating his target. The man had seen Luther Lindsay as just another corporate executive to be manipulated and discarded. He'd never realized he was hunting a weapon that would hunt him back. 6 months later, Luther Lindsay stood in the federal courthouse as Philip Morgan was sentenced to 25 years for espionage and conspiracy to commit treason. The Russian spy network that had supported him was in shambles, with 14 arrests across 3 countries and millions of dollars in seized assets. Rosario had testified against Philip in exchange for immunity, revealing details about the surveillance operation that helped prosecutors build their case. She'd been genuinely shocked to learn Philip's true identity and the scope of the conspiracy she'd unknowingly supported. "I thought he loved me," she'd said during their divorce proceedings, her voice hollow with betrayal. Luther felt no satisfaction in her pain. Rosario had been as much a victim as an accomplice, seduced by a professional who specialized in exploiting lonely spouses. The woman who'd shared his life for 7 years had been turned into a weapon against him. And while Luther could forgive her weakness, he could never trust her again. Project Blackbird had been completed successfully, its security enhanced by the lessons learned from Philip's infiltration attempt. The Pentagon had awarded Luther's company an additional contract worth $500 million, recognizing the role they'd played in exposing a major espionage network. "Drink?" Marcus asked as they left the courthouse. "Just one," Luther replied. "We're celebrating tonight, but tomorrow we get back to work." They drove to O'Malley's, the bar where Luther's team traditionally gathered after completing difficult missions. The atmosphere was subdued but satisfied. They'd won a significant victory, but everyone understood the cost. "Any word from an agency about Philip's contacts?" asked Sarah Chun, Luther's head of development. 3 more arrests last week, Marcus reported. Turns out Philip was part of a much larger network targeting American tech companies. "Our investigation broke open cases the FBI had been working for years." Luther raised his beer in a toast. "To Marcus, Sarah, and the whole team. You didn't just save the company, you protected national security." As his team celebrated around him, Luther reflected on the lessons of the past year. He learned that the greatest threats often came from inside, that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford, and that the skills he developed in military service remained relevant in civilian life. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Impressive work on Morgan. There's another situation developing that could use your expertise. Are you interested?" Luther studied the message for a long moment. The sender had used specific phrasing that identified them as a government contact, someone who knew about his military background and recent success against the Russian network. He typed back, "Send details." Luther Lindsay had spent years building a successful business, but the Philip Morgan case had revealed his true calling. He wasn't just a cybersecurity executive. He was a defender, someone who could identify and neutralize threats that traditional law enforcement might miss. As his team continued celebrating around him, Luther began planning his company's evolution. Lindsay Tech Solutions would remain a cybersecurity firm, but it would also become something more, a private intelligence operation that specialized in protecting American interests from foreign infiltration. Philip Morgan had intended to destroy Luther's life, but instead, he'd given Luther a new purpose. The spy's greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating Luther's capabilities. It had been showing Luther what he was truly capable of when properly motivated. The war against foreign intelligence operations was far from over, but Luther Lindsay was ready for whatever came next. He'd learned to fight on a new battlefield, and he'd learned to win. Outside O'Malley's, the city lights sparkled like a circuit board, and Luther smiled as he contemplated the future. Some weapons were forged in fire, others in betrayal. Philip Morgan had tried to break him, but instead had created something far more dangerous. A protector who understood that in the modern world, the greatest battles were fought not with bullets, but with information. And Luther Lindsay intended to win every single one of them. Epilogue. 5 years later. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling campus of Lindsay Defense Solutions as Luther walked through the high-security entrance. What had once been a modest cybersecurity firm now occupied 40,000 square feet of former military installation, complete with underground bunkers that housed some of the most sophisticated digital warfare equipment outside of government facilities. At 43, Luther carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his true purpose. The past 5 years had transformed him from a successful businessman into something approaching a legend in intelligence circles. The Philip Morgan case had been just the beginning. Morning briefing in 10. Mark is called out as Luther passed the operations center. The facility hummed with activity, dozens of analysts, former military personnel, and recruited talent working on contracts that officially didn't exist. Luther's morning routine now included security briefings that would have classified him for high-level government clearance a decade earlier. Lindsay Defense Solutions had evolved far beyond cybersecurity. They were now America's premier private intelligence firm, specializing in counter-espionage operations that traditional agencies couldn't handle due to political or legal constraints. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the months following Philip Morgan's conviction, Luther had been quietly approached by officials from multiple agencies, FBI, CIA, NSA, and departments whose names never appeared in congressional budgets. They'd all reached the same conclusion. The private sector needed someone who could fight foreign intelligence operations without the bureaucratic limitations that hampered government responses. Luther had accepted that challenge, but on his terms. Lindsay Defense Solutions operated with complete autonomy, taking contract from verified government sources while maintaining the freedom to pursue threats that others might ignore. Their success rate was unprecedented, and their discretion was absolute. "What's on the schedule?" Luther asked as he entered his secure office, a room that resembled a military command center more than a corporate executive suite. Sarah Chun, now his deputy director of operations, handed him a tablet containing the day's intelligence summary. 3 active operations, 2 new threat assessments, and a personal matter that requires your attention. Luther scrolled through the updates. Operation Nighthawk, tracking a Chinese technology theft ring, was entering its final phase. Operation Sandcastle, dismantling an Iranian cyber infiltration network, had identified 12 new targets. Operation Blackwater, investigating Russian influence in American energy companies, had uncovered evidence that would likely result in congressional hearings. "What's the personal matter?" Luther asked. Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Philip Morgan died in federal prison yesterday. Apparent suicide, but the circumstances are suspicious." Luther set down the tablet, his mind immediately analyzing the implications. Philip had been serving his sentence at ADX Florence, a supermax facility where inmates were kept in near total isolation. Suicide was rare, but not impossible, though the timing seemed convenient for certain parties who might prefer Philip's permanent silence. "Any indication this was external?" Luther asked. "Prison investigation is ongoing, but initial reports suggest he used a sharpened plastic fragment to open his carotid artery. Very precise, very efficient, almost surgical." Luther nodded grimly. Philip had retained his training even in prison, and desperate men with specialized skills could accomplish remarkable things. But Luther suspected there was more to the story. Prison politics, Russian handlers tying up loose ends, or perhaps genuine despair at a life wasted on failed operations. "Monitor the investigation, but don't interfere," Luther decided. Philip made his choices. "We've got living threats to worry about." Luther's interaction with his ex-wife had evolved into something neither bitter nor friendly, a professional courtesy maintained for practical reasons. Rosario had rebuilt her life with impressive determination, using her experience with intelligence operations to forge a new career in corporate security consulting. They met once every few months at a neutral location, sharing information that occasionally proved valuable to both their careers. Today's meeting was at the Metropolitan Museum, where Rosario waited near the Egyptian collection, looking surprisingly at ease. "You look well," she said as Luther approached. At 39, Rosario had developed a harder edge, her natural beauty now tempered by an awareness of how easily trust could be weaponized. "As do you. I heard about the Blackstone contract. Congratulations." Rosario smiled slightly. "Protecting corporate executives from exactly the kind of infiltration I fell victim to. There's a certain poetry to it." They walked slowly through the galleries, two people who had shared a life now connected only by mutual wariness and hard-earned wisdom. "I've been thinking about Philip," Rosario said eventually. "About the news from yesterday." Luther wasn't surprised she'd heard. Rosario's new career had given her access to intelligence networks that few civilians ever glimpsed. "He was always going to end badly," Luther replied. "Men like Philip don't retire to Florida and write memoirs." "Do you think he really killed himself? Does it matter?" "Philip's chapter is closed either way. The network he represented is still active, but he's no longer part of it." Rosario stopped in front of a display of ancient weaponry, studying a bronze sword with obvious symbolism. "I've been offered a position with the State Department. Counterintelligence Division." Luther raised an eyebrow. "Significant career change. They want someone with real-world experience in how foreign operatives target American citizens. Apparently, my testimony in the Morgan case made an impression. Will you take it?" Rosario considered the question carefully. "I think so. It feels like the right kind of penance. Using what I learned to protect other people from making my mistakes." Luther studied his former wife's profile, seeing the woman he'd married, but also recognizing how profoundly she'd changed. The naive event coordinator who'd been seduced by a charming stranger was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true cost of misplaced trust. "You'd be good at it," Luther said finally. "You understand the emotional manipulation better than most analysts." "Thank you. That means something coming from you." They parted ways at the museum's entrance, both heading back to lives that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. Luther felt no lingering romantic attachment, but he respected what Rosario had become. She'd been a victim who chose to become a protector, and that transformation deserved acknowledgement. Lindsay Defense Solutions now employed over 300 people across multiple continents. Luther's original cybersecurity business had become just one division of a comprehensive intelligence operation that rivaled government agencies in sophistication and exceeded them in flexibility. The company's success had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Luther regularly received recruitment offers from private military contractors, foreign governments, and corporations willing to pay astronomical sums for his services. He'd turn them all down, maintaining his focus on protecting American interests while building something lasting. "The Jakarta operation is complete," Marcus reported during their weekly strategy meeting. "Indonesian government has requested a permanent advisory position." Luther reviewed the file. Lindsay Defense had spent 6 months dismantling a Chinese influence network that had infiltrated Indonesia's technology sector. The operation had required coordination with local intelligence services, careful political maneuvering, and the kind of digital warfare techniques that few organizations could execute. "What's our assessment of long-term stability?" Luther asked. "Good. We've trained their internal security teams and established monitoring protocols. They should be able to handle routine threats independently." Sarah Chun added her own update. "The European Union is requesting a formal partnership agreement. They want us to establish a permanent presence in Brussels to coordinate counterintelligence operations across member states." Luther leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. European expansion would require significant resources and careful navigation of international law, but it also represented an opportunity to build the kind of global intelligence network that could preempt threats before they reached American shores. "Draft a proposal," Luther decided. but make it clear we maintain operational independence. We advise and coordinate, but we don't take orders from EU bureaucrats. The meeting continued for another hour, covering operations in South America, Africa, and the Pacific Rim. Luther's organization had become a key component of America's unofficial intelligence apparatus, filling gaps that traditional agencies couldn't address. But success brought new challenges. Foreign governments were becoming more sophisticated in their attempts to infiltrate or corrupt Luther's operations. 3 separate attempts to plant assets within Lindsay Defense had been detected and neutralized in the past year, and Luther knew more would come. Luther's personal life had undergone its own transformation. The bitter aftermath of his divorce had eventually given way to a more balanced existence, though his romantic relationships remained carefully compartmentalized from his professional responsibilities. He'd been dating Virginia Goodman for 18 months, a federal prosecutor who specialized in national security cases and understood the demands of his work. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the stakes involved in their respective careers. "How was Jakarta?" Virginia asked over dinner at their usual restaurant, a quiet place where they could speak freely without concern for surveillance. "Successful. The Chinese won't be stealing Indonesian technology for the foreseeable future." Virginia smiled. "You say that like you shut down a neighborhood lemonade stand instead of dismantling an international espionage network. Different scale, same principles. Identify the threat, cut off their resources, eliminate their operational capability. And you make it sound so simple." Luther considered that assessment. It is simple in concept. Execution is where things get complicated. Virginia had prosecuted enough espionage cases to understand the complexities Luther navigated daily. She'd also seen enough of his work to appreciate the careful balance he maintained between aggressive action and legal constraints. "The Morgan case files are being declassified next month," she mentioned. "Justice Department wants to use them for training materials." Luther nodded. "Good. Other investigators should learn from Philip's techniques. He was exceptional at what he did, which made him exceptionally dangerous. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't discovered the surveillance devices?" Luther had considered that question many times. Philip would have eventually extracted enough information to compromise Blackbird. That technology would be in Russian hands. American military networks would be vulnerable, and probably dozens of foreign operatives would have used his success as a blueprint for their own operations. "So you saved more than just your company." "We all saved more than just my company. This was never a one-man operation." Luther's team had indeed proven exceptional. Marcus remained his closest advisor and head of security operations. Sarah Chun had evolved into a strategic thinker whose analyses shaped policy at the highest levels of government. The company's other key personnel, recruited from military, intelligence, and academic backgrounds, had created an organizational culture that prized competence above politics and results above publicity. The intelligence landscape continued evolving at an accelerating pace. Traditional state-sponsored espionage was being supplemented by criminal organizations with sophisticated capabilities, terrorist groups with access to cutting-edge technology, and corporate entities willing to cross legal and ethical boundaries for competitive advantage. Luther's organization had adapted by developing new methodologies that combined traditional human intelligence with advanced digital warfare techniques. They'd pioneered approaches to cyber infiltration that government agencies were still trying to understand, and their success rate in identifying and neutralizing foreign operations had made them indispensable to American security planning. But Luther was increasingly concerned about threats that weren't yet visible on anyone's radar. His analysts had identified patterns suggesting coordination between previously independent threat actors. Chinese intelligence services sharing resources with Iranian cyber warfare units, Russian organized crime groups providing logistic support for North Korean operations, and new alliances that transcended traditional geopolitical boundaries. "We're seeing evolution in real time," Luther explained during a classified briefing to congressional intelligence committees. "Foreign adversaries are learning from each other's successes and adapting their methods accordingly. They're becoming more sophisticated, more patient, and more willing to invest resources in long-term operations. Representative Carlton Hurst, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, leaned forward with obvious concern. What's your assessment of current American preparedness? Improving, but not fast enough. Government agencies are constrained by bureaucracy, legal limitations, and political considerations. Private organizations like mine can move faster, but we have resource limitations and limited authority. What do you recommend? Luther had been preparing this answer for months. Expanded public-private partnerships. Formal coordination mechanisms between government agencies and private intelligence firms. Legislative protection for operations that serve national security interests. And significant investment in next-generation capabilities. The briefing continued for 2 hours, covering specific threats, operational successes, and strategic recommendations. Luther left with the satisfaction of knowing his warnings were being taken seriously, but also with the knowledge that implementation would be slow and probably incomplete. Luther's reputation had grown to the point where his presence was requested at international conferences on security and intelligence. The latest invitation had come from the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, where Luther was scheduled to deliver a keynote address on private sector counterintelligence in the 21st century. The conference brought together intelligence professionals, academic researchers, and policymakers from 47 countries. Luther's presentation drew standing room-only attendance, with many participants seeking insights into methods that had proven remarkably effective against state-sponsored espionage. Traditional intelligence operations assumed clear boundaries between military and civilian targets. Luther explained to the assembled audience. Modern threats ignore those boundaries entirely. Foreign adversaries target private citizens, commercial enterprises, academic institutions, and infrastructure systems with equal sophistication. He clicked to the next slide, showing a network diagram that illustrated the complexity of modern threat landscapes. The Philip Morgan case study demonstrates how foreign intelligence services are adapting to exploit American openness and trust. Morgan didn't target government facilities or military installations. He targeted the personal life of a private citizen whose company held valuable contracts. During the question and answer session, Luther faced inquiries that range from technical methodology to legal and ethical considerations. How do you balance aggressive counterintelligence operations with respect for civil liberties? Asked Dr. Elsa Bentley from the University of Oxford. By maintaining clear operational boundaries and accepting government oversight, Luther replied, "My organization operates under legal frameworks that provide accountability while preserving operational effectiveness. We're not vigilantes. We're contractors working within established systems. But your methods sometimes exceed what government agencies can legally accomplish," pressed Professor Ramon Chambers from Georgetown University. True, but that's precisely why private sector capabilities are necessary. Foreign adversaries don't limit themselves to tactics that government agencies can easily counter. We have to be willing to match their sophistication while maintaining our legal and ethical standards. The conference generated significant media attention and several new partnership opportunities. Luther returned to the United States with invitations to establish operations in 12 new countries and formal cooperation agreements with intelligence services that had previously been reluctant to work with private contractors. 5 years after discovering Philip Morgan's surveillance devices in his basement, Luther Lindsay had built something unprecedented in American intelligence history. Lindsay Defense Solutions had become the template for private sector counterintelligence operations, with methods that were being studied and copied by organizations worldwide. But Luther's greatest satisfaction came not from professional success, but from a knowledge that his work was making a measurable difference in protecting American security. The Morgan Network had been completely dismantled, its remaining members either imprisoned or neutralized. Project Blackbird had been successfully implemented, providing security for critical infrastructure that foreign adversaries had previously been able to penetrate. More importantly, the techniques Luther's organization had developed were being shared with government agencies, allied nations, and other private contractors. The lessons learned from a Morgan case were being taught at intelligence training facilities, incorporated into threat assessment protocols, and used to identify similar operations before they could achieve their objectives. 10 years from now, where do you see all this going? Virginia asked one evening as they walked through the neighborhood where Luther had once lived with Rosario. Luther considered the question while looking at the house he'd been forced to abandon. New owners had renovated extensively, erasing any trace of the surveillance network that had violated his privacy and threatened national security. 10 years from now, the threat landscape will be completely different, Luther said finally. Artificial intelligence will change everything. How we gather intelligence, how we analyze threats, how we conduct operations. Quantum computing will make current encryption methods obsolete. Biotechnology will create new vulnerabilities we can barely imagine. And Lindsay Defense Solutions will evolve accordingly. We'll recruit different talent, develop new capabilities, and probably handle threats that don't exist yet. Luther paused, then added, but the core mission will remain the same. Protecting American interests from foreign adversaries who want to steal our technology, corrupt our institutions, and undermine our way of life. They walked past the park where Luther had confronted Philip Morgan, now just another peaceful neighborhood gathering place with no indication of the drama that had unfolded there years earlier. Do you ever miss the simpler life? Virginia asked, when your biggest concern was quarterly earnings reports. Luther smiled. Never. Philip Morgan thought he was destroying my life when he infiltrated my home and corrupted my marriage. Instead, he showed me what I was really meant to do. Some people find their calling through inspiration. I found mine through betrayal. As they returned to Luther's current home, a fortress-like structure with security systems that would impress military installations, Luther reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The naive businessman who had trusted too easily was gone, replaced by someone who understood that freedom required constant vigilance and that protecting American interests sometimes demanded methods that comfortable civilians preferred not to contemplate. Philip Morgan's greatest failure hadn't been underestimating Luther's capabilities or misreading his psychological profile. Philip's greatest failure had been assuming that destroying Luther's old life would leave him broken and vulnerable. Instead, Philip had forged a weapon that would spend decades hunting people exactly like him. Luther Lindsay was no longer just a successful businessman or even a skilled intelligence operative. He had become something more dangerous and more necessary. A protector who understood that in the modern world, the greatest battles were fought not on traditional battlefields, but in the shadows where ordinary citizens never looked. And in those shadows, Luther Lindsay intended to keep winning for as long as America had enemies who needed defeating. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.